Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Meeting out of London, York, Thursday, the 6th of November, 2025, in person and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 30th of October, 2025, were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society: an Etruscan lady in York, the Grand Tour and an antiquarian collections in the Yorkshire Museum by Professor Maureen Carroll, FSA. Thanks are returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, the 13th of November, 2025, and then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure to sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Elections.
The following candidates for fellowship election are included in the ballot which closes on the 27th of November. Rachel Bond, Director of Collections at Eton College. Alessio Ciccioni, geoscientist, academic and contributor to public archaeology. Tom Edwards, Managing Director of an art gallery specialising in British works of art. Andrew Fairbairn, Professor of Archaeology of the Use of Ancient Plants. Alfred Hawkins, Curator of Historic Buildings at Historic Royal Palaces and Cathedral Archaeologist for Portsmouth Cathedral. Owen Hopkins, Architectural Historian and Curator. Michelle Johansson, Learning and Outreach Manager at the Society of Antiquaries, London. Rachel Morley, Director of the Friends of Friendless Churches. Francis Sands, Curator of Drawings and Books at St. John Soane's Museum. Mark Stevens, LSE County Archivist, notably responsible for the archives of Broadmoor Hospital, Reading Prison, the Thames Conservancy, Bracknell New Town. Jade Whitlam, Lecturer in Archaeology, promoting public engagement.
Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. Our lecturers this evening are Dr. Sophia Adams, Fellow, and Professor Tom Moore, Fellow. Sophia is Curator of First Millennium European and Roman Conquest period collections at the British Museum. She's been there since 2021, prior to which she was a postdoc at the University of Bristol and University of Glasgow, the former working on the social context of later prehistoric metalworking, and the latter drawing on her PhD at Leicester on the chronology of Roman brooches, linking them with radiocarbon dating. She's recently been researching the Enderby bark shield, re-investigating the bog bodies from Lindo Moss, as well as the Melsonby hoard, which we're going to hear about this evening. Busy person. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Tom, who was a student in Durham when I taught there, and is now Professor of Archaeology at the University of Durham, specialising in British European Iron Age with a focus on landscape and field archaeology. His recent research includes publications on late Iron Age power centres in Europe, with field projects at the major optimum Stanwick in North Yorkshire, Badgenden near Cirencester, as well as at Bibracte in France. He's currently researching the recently discovered Melsonby hoard, of which he's speaking this evening. And he's jointly leading a Leave Hume Trust research project undertaking case study of monumental linear earthworks in Britain. So we welcome our two speakers. The title of the lecture is The Melsonby Hoard, Vehicles and Power in Late Iron Age North Yorkshire.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Martin. And good evening, everyone. Before I start, I think it's worth saying that whilst, of course, it'll be Sophie and I doing all the talking tonight, one of the pleasures of the Melsonby project is that it's been a collaborative team effort from the very beginning. From the finder, Peter Heads, to a dedicated team of excavators, including colleagues from Archaeological Services at Durham, and a team of conservators led by my colleague Emily Williams at Durham as well. So what we'll present tonight is the work of many people, not just ourselves, and it's our pleasure to do so. Now, I guess many of you have heard of Melsonby because of the media release back in March of this year. I have to say, the evening before we did the public announcement of this, I spoke to Peter Heads, the finder of it, and said, don't worry, Peter, it'll just be a small article in the Darlington and Stockton Times, and maybe if we're lucky, an interview on Radio York. It was slightly more intense than that, but I think you can probably all appreciate that there was a lot we couldn't say in that media release, a lot that there isn't time in those short gobbets to kind of talk about. So tonight we want to say more about the nature of the discovery of the hoard, more about the contents of the hoard, and then a little bit about our initial interpretation of what we think the hoard represents. So starting with the discovery then, well, just before Christmas in 2021, I have to say, I'm ashamed to say that I wasn't thinking much about Iron Age hoards. I was mostly thinking about Christmas when Peter Heads called me to say he'd been metal detecting and he'd made a discovery. Now, I knew Peter a little bit because I'd been doing geophysics in the North Yorkshire landscape for a number of years. And my interest was particularly piqued when he mentioned where that discovery was. And that was the field that Colin Hazelgrove and others had suggested was perhaps the location of an earlier discovery, the so-called Stanwick hoard, which despite its name, it was found in 1843, it wasn't quite sure exactly where it had been found. So it raised my interest of, had Peter perhaps found what had been left behind by the workmen in 1843? And could we kind of confirm that this was the location of the Stanwick hoard and perhaps then sort of identify the archaeological context that it came from? So the next day, standing in a very wet, muddy field in December in North Yorkshire, looked down the holes that Peter had dug. We realised that this was going to be a treasure case. So we contacted the Portable Antiquities scheme and my colleague Sophie at the British Museum, and very kindly the landowners said that we could excavate the finds to retrieve them archaeologically. So how did that happen? Well, the first thing to note is that Peter identified 2 signals on his metal detector and dug 2 small holes. So we opened up 2 trenches, trench 1 that we now call hoard 1 and trench 2, which we now call hoard 2. So what did we discover? Well, the first thing to note is that we realized quite quickly that the finds, as you can see here, were from an Iron Age ditch. That hole in the middle there is Peter's initial hole into the feature. And the initial indication was a scatter that you can see in the top right up there of horse harness, some of which is on the right there from the late Iron Age, and a nice collection of finds. And I have to say, I'm not quite sure what Sophie, I know that we've actually discussed this, but at that point I thought, this is a couple of days' work. We'll dig those finds out, excavate the ditch, and we can all go home. Bear in mind that we didn't have any funding for it at this point. I don't think it's a plot spoiler to tell you, it didn't quite work out like that, because as you perhaps know, as soon as we removed that horse harness beneath it, we saw this thing, this iron band here. And pretty soon realized that this was an iron tyre, perhaps from an Iron Age chariot, something we hadn't been expecting. And then as the team continued to dig, it just got bigger and bigger, so that it continued down the ditch about 1 metre, and then we had to extend our trench widthways to encompass the extent of it. Now, Hoard 1 is focused really on what I refer to, perhaps not very archaeologically, but as a nest of tyres, basically. So everything you're looking at there, those curvilinear things, are iron tyres stacked on top of each other. But pretty soon we realised there was other things, very interesting and exceptional things amongst it, including this upturned copper alloy cauldron with its base stoved in as well. And you can get a bit of a sense, I think, here of the structure of Hoard 1. What you're looking at there is at the top left, up here, one of the upper layers, and then as you go down to the bottom right, almost slices through that stack of iron tyres. And you're looking at all of these are iron tyres. And note that all of them, more or less, are distorted and bent out of shape. Some of them, like this one you can see here, almost bent into a figure of 8 shape. And we'll come back to that when we think about what does the hoard represent. And then at the very bottom of this Iron Age ditch that had been laid in, another surprise vessel at the bottom. And I'll leave Sophie to tell you what that might be. Now, there's a couple of things about the deposition of hoard 1 and its structure, which I think are important to note at this point, and we'll come back to when we think about why was the hoard deposited. One thing is the fact that, unlike a lot of archaeological deposits that you'll have come across, it was full of voids as we went through that deposit, full of gaps. And those tell us some interesting things. One thing is they tell us that there may have been more organic material, wooden material, textiles, which are no longer in the hoard. So there's all this other information that we might have had. It also probably, I think, tells us, if you imagine that the stack of those tyres, that this has been deposited rapidly. This is probably one sequence of events. This is not something which has accumulated over time. You'll also, you can see in these images here, a number of rocks or boulders in amongst the hoard. There was even one in situ in the base of that cauldron. So it had been used to smash the base of that cauldron. Now that's quite significant in terms of the fact that rocks have been thrown onto the deposit. And again, when we come back to the interpretation, think about that in terms of the fact that this is not sort of surreptitious placing of this material in the ditch. This is a noisy, deliberate act where they're breaking the objects when they go in. Now, frankly, if Trench 1 and all the things that Sophie's going to show you within it wouldn't be enough to kind of probably last out the rest of our careers, Sophie. Mine might be shorter than yours, but we then, of course, had Peter's second signal to turn our attention to, which became Trench 2. This too, we realised, was deposited in the base of an Iron Age ditch. You can just see that grey material there, perhaps. And Hoard 2 is quite different in some respects from Hoard 1, but no less interesting. It's smaller. It's about just over 1 metre long. And because it was more discrete, we could treat it slightly differently. One thing to note was that when it was being excavated, it has this iron concretion over the top of it, which Sophie might explain what the reason why for that. And you can see some of the copper alloy tubes poking out of that. But what we realised is that if, to excavate that would be to break some of the objects as you took them out. Because of its size, there was the potential to block lift it. So you can see the team here have dug round it to be lifted and away. And thanks to the team from the farm and the excavators, and also our colleagues in conservation like Emily Williams, it was encased in plaster of Paris, put onto a pallet, and then shipped back to Durham to be excavated in the laboratory. That also gave us the opportunity to then CT scan it to see what was in it before we started excavating it. And thanks to the great work of MuVIS at the University of Southampton, we could take it down to them. They CT scanned it. And you can see here that they had to build an entire new rig to do that. Because, I mean, you've got to remember the block is both very heavy, but also very fragile, and did a wonderful job. And I'm going to let Sophie reveal what the CT scan showed. You're getting all the best bits. And then Emily, my colleague at Durham, had the, I always think enviable or unenviable task, depends on how you feel about it, of them picking away at the soil to reveal what was inside it. And I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who can tell you a bit more about what is in both Hoard 1 and Hoard 2.
Thank you, Tom. So this work that Emily carried out here was partially done with an amazing tool called a paleo tool, tiny little drill. Incredible patience to do it because it sounds like you're in the dentist the whole time you're running this drill, or at least my dental experience. So this is the block excavated. So there's no or next to no soil left on it at this point. And this is really quite an incredible thing that it's held itself and take you back to some pictures from the site from Hoard 1. And trickled among those tyres that Tom was describing to you were lots of pieces of copper alloy items. A lot of them have got this lovely sort of greeny blue colour. And most of it's to do with horse harness. Some of it was incredibly large. So if you look at the hand up in the top left for you, they're holding a strap union. Normally strap unions are only, say, at most 5, maybe 10 centimetres long if you want. These are absolutely enormous. And so just the style of those objects help us work out that we were definitely right, that we were somewhere in the Iron Age with these objects. But sticking with Hoard 2 for a moment to explain this kind of bulk of finds. Now, if you were lying at the bottom of the ditch and the hoard was deposited on top of you, this would be your view because you're currently looking at what was the bottom. And across it are a series of iron spears, and those spears had corroded against the base of the deposit. Now, we didn't find any iron spears on the top of it, but again, we think there's possibly ironwork that has caused these layers of corrosion. But another feature that was identified while Emily was carefully excavating this were some what she calls skeuomorphs of textile. So this is mineralized remnants of textile. So what we think happened was that the whole bundle was actually wrapped in a kind of textile membrane. And by having this membrane around it, it's actually caused an environment that means you get this kind of build-up of sort of corrosion deposits at top and bottom, and also stops soil going through the middle. And the other thing that helps hold it together, and it's very reassuring to know afterwards in a way with the block lift that it was holding itself together, because some of the iron items in it, things that look like potentially we might even have a pilum, which is a type of very narrow spearhead, and other items have been threaded through the copper alloy. So the whole thing has been carefully bundled together and held together. So here's one view of another side of Hoard 2, and I just wanted to point out some of the items that you can see on the edge of it. So here we have three things clustered together. You have the edge of a bridle bit here with this lovely starburst design. You have part of a chariot, so a rein ring, part of a nave band. And if anyone's not sure where those go on a vehicle, don't worry, I'll come back to that. We also have some rather delightful little pieces as well. So here we have this little boar's head. You can see the snout, the tusks, the eyes. It's just a little copper alloy decorative boar's head. And if you want to have a look inside, well, the best way to do that is to work our way through the CT scans. So this is just a slice through. And I've put some examples of objects from the other hoards to show you what you might be spotting within there. Don't worry, I won't test you at the end exactly what you've seen, but I'm sure you're all noticing now some nave bands. You will have seen a chariot earlier. You'll possibly pick up the starburst bridle bit at this point. And that's quite interesting, that starburst design, because we don't see that on any of the bits in Hoard 1 or in the Stanwick hoard, the 1843 discovery. And down in the bottom right of the image there, and the examples of objects from these hoards, that more golden coloured chariot is from the 1843 hoard, when conservation practices were different. But it shows you again, we've got some differences in design, even though we've got similar objects in all of these hoards. So what about these bits? The loranary, this is what we have. It's the metal bits from horse harness. We don't have any of the organic straps, although it's possible some of them were present when they went into the ground. So for those of you who like your typology, it's a 3-link derivative bit, which is very useful because that places, again, late Iron Age. And when we were excavating the finds early on, it was useful to have those kind of key items that would help focus our attention on what period we were looking at, because we also found some of them were decorated with coral. And coral is more familiar with earlier in the Iron Age in Britain, certainly between about 400 and 200 BC. But the more I look, the more I find on later finds. So there was some confusion at first if we definitely got the dating right. And you have to hold your ground. Yes, I'm sure I have. You know, we have triple-lobed projection turrets, you know. It's going to be late Iron Age. I think Tom has heard enough about types of turrets for a while. And some of them were absolutely enormous as well. So they don't need to be this big and fancy. So this is the largest turret ring we have here doing our Lord of the Rings moment. But if you think about the ponies, they're ponies, they're not horses were being used at this time. So pairs of ponies to pull chariots or wagons. And so if you imagine them adorned with all this elaborate harness, they'd look something more like the National Shire horses in their competitions today than you might imagine for what the Iron Age horses may have been dressed like, because really it is dressed for the horses. So turrets generally come in sets of 5. You have a larger middle one and then 2 on either side, and these are for the reins to pass through. With the help of our illustrator at the British Museum, Craig Williams, we put together a very quick diagram to show you how that works. My pony's bottoms there. Some of you who are good with attention to detail will notice that this is not a matching set of turrets. Those on the left side are slightly different to the ones on the right. I've just used them because those are the ones that are well preserved. But we do think we've got sets. Now, 31 complete turrets does not work out as complete sets. So could it be that we have sets going across the hoards, or could it be we haven't got complete sets going in, or maybe some people only used 4, and so on? A lot of questions there. So I mentioned coral. We also have glass, we have enamel. Down the bottom here in the middle, this lovely little strap fitting is the only item that's been taken off the hoard 2 block, the only loose item. And it has this blue glass on it. This is a side view of one of the turrets you saw earlier, which has red and yellow alternating pattern, which looks to be enamel settings. We have the coral here on this strap fittings that's completely degraded and leached out. And if you want to see what the coral might have looked like when it was fresh, the example here from the Witham Shield in Lincolnshire, the wonderful preservation of a watery environment actually has helped preserve that reddish colour against the gold and bronze. So these things would look quite elaborate. And I've included this V-shaped piece down here, which has a hinge, which I'm not entirely sure where it goes on the vehicle yet. But this element in the middle, the bluey element, was actually found right down in the deposit, and the V-shape was found in that first upper layer. So these 2 parts that are definitely, they don't directly join, but they seem to be part of the same object or matching objects, are appearing at these 2 stages and perhaps treated differently. Perhaps the coral has been burnt out at that one. And some items we didn't expect would come out in the condition that it was possible to get them out. So part of the treasure process requires you to make sure that the finds are shown and valued and assessed in their as found state. But sometimes to assess them, you have to clean off some of the soil. So where necessary, this was done. And this is just the fantastic work of Emily Williams to pick out these beautiful blue beads on this strap fitting here, another massive strap fitting. And blue beads, again, are quite rare on horse harness. The more I look now, I will probably start discovering more. But it's also interesting that there's often an association with blue beads earlier in the Iron Age and burials of women. So it's kind of interesting to see, is there any potential gender connection between these objects or not? And the Stanwick hoard, so this is the hoard that I'm responsible for in my role at the British Museum. So all the Melsonby finds are now under the care of Yorkshire Museum. So they've been able to acquire those finds, which is fantastic. But it's a good reminder to me to look back at these 1843 discoveries and also interpret some of the fragments. So the highlighted items there, we have matching parts of those or complete ones in the Trench 1 hoard. So we can start to think about what these parts are, and some of them are decorative elements to go over the yokes. Some of them maybe even shield adornments. We have occasionally matching bridle bits. If anybody wants to know even more detail about the minutiae of the finds, I will be giving another talk for the later prehistoric finds group just on the finds. So keep an eye out for that. Now the vehicle parts. So this is what's really intriguing me at the moment. At first, you're always caught by the sort of the bright bluey green items. But once you start looking at the ironwork, it becomes really fascinating. Where does it come from? We have 28 iron tyres, and so far that's the highest number ever found at one site. Some of them are very large, so the diameter ranges up to about 1.08 metres if I've measured the circumference correctly. They're quite broad and thick, much broader and thicker than a lot of iron tyres. And the smallest one is more about 80 centimetres diameter. And they're all bent out of shape, and it would have taken a lot of effort to bend these out of shape. And potentially heating. We have evidence for hematite patches on some of these tyres, which is an indication that they've been subjected to high heat. But where do these parts come from? So the iron tyres, they go round the wooden wheel. The nave bands or sleeves or hub elements, I've discovered that each region in Britain uses different terms for different parts of wagons. It gets incredibly complicated, but there's a lovely book out there that compares all of these. So depending on where I'm talking regionally, I should probably adapt which terms I use. I think nave is more southern. So we have these elements. We have iron elements that go perhaps on the inner side. We have copper alloy decorative bits. Oh, sorry, gone the wrong way. And then we have linchpins. So the linchpin goes through where the axle passes through the middle of the wheel, helps hold it all together. But we only have 9 of those, which is a little bit odd. So is it possible that among some of the sort of plainer bolts, perhaps we have linchpins that weren't decorative? Or is something else going on here? And then we have these things, which I'm very excited to talk about because I get to use the word kingpin in an archaeology talk. It makes it sound cool. So kingpins and draft bars, again, there are about 20 different names for these parts. But these are elements that are necessary for a wagon, a four-wheel vehicle, rather than a chariot. And I've shown you some examples here much earlier from about 500 BC, the Vix wagon, and also from 1st century BC, these preserved examples from Denmark. This little diagram might give you an idea of how they work. So this part, which is the back of a wagon, very basic drawn here, is kind of all you need for your chariot. Put your box on that. It will turn as you need with the ponies. Add a part onto the front. Now we've got a four-wheeled vehicle. And to hold that together, we want a kingpin to allow the two parts to rotate and also to move apart a bit if you hit a bump. And the draft bar to help pull that front element. So there's our kingpin, there's our draft bar, and we have two of each of those. So by that estimate, we've at least got two four-wheeled wagons. And looking back at the 1843 finds, I've now realised that there's at least one kingpin amongst those. So that accounts for 8 tyres. What about the other 20? Oh, and this is just an idea of how, you know, the box could be fitting on top. It may not be that wide a vehicle. Again, this is something to consider in the future. And then we also had these U-shaped brackets, which we've all been racking our heads over. We've been talking with Robert Herford, who creates chariots, Iron Age chariots, but he's also been a wagon builder for decades. And we can't quite find where they come from, except I'm convinced, but I may change my mind in a few months, that they sit under the axle. Because when I was watching the funeral of the Queen, the Victorian gun wagons have these underneath the axle to hold it in place. So that would suggest they're for attaching to some very heavy, hefty vehicle. Those are examples of them in the trench. So could we be looking at something like the Dybjerg wagons here from Denmark, where you've got this lightweight but very decorative four-wheel vehicle, or could we be looking at something even heavier, more like these Roman vehicles? If we look at the adornments, you know, we have these incredible items that, at best, I can just call them finials or something, because I don't quite know. They're not territs, the one on the right, but it's, you know, it almost looks like one. And I think if that had been reported as a find on its own, I'd have started to wonder whether maybe it was medieval. It's so curious, the design. And over on the left there is one of those really ornate parts to go over the yoke. So the whole vehicle would have been decorated. And on the Dybjerg wagons, they have these fantastic sort of horn elements with a little human face. And do you remember the boar's head in Trench 2 in the block? Well, right next to that, some of you may have spotted, was this tiny little face made of repoussé, so it's sheet metal with the kind of shape of the face pushed out. Well, I think there we go. That's exactly like the ones from Dybjerg, and therefore that's what our wagons were. I don't know. But I think it's interesting to imagine, could we be having these decorative features of vehicles? And then what else was in there? Was there anything else? Well, we had an iron mirror, massive mirror. So where we tend to get mirrors that are of iron in Iron Age, they tend to be fairly small, and again, sort of earlier. So we're thinking about the East Yorkshire chariot burials. Where you get these larger mirrors, tends to be the bronze ones later in cremations and inhumations, sort of late 1st century BC to 1st century AD. And where it's been possible to sex the remains, they're often found with women. So when we saw that there was this big iron mirror, you're thinking, oh, is this a grave here? And the whole time, you know, with this bundle of stuff, we're imagining, would we find human remains? But there were no human remains. And then there were also these 3 massive spears. So setting aside the smaller spearheads that are in Trench 2, you have these massive ones, or lances. So these are just 2 examples here. They're quite difficult to picture because of how they sort of corroded and things would join them together. But, you know, huge lances for parades, perhaps. Also buried within the deposit. And that's just a little x-ray there to show you the handle of the mirror. And then the cauldron. So Tom's talked about this amazing cauldron. Because they're in the audience today, I need to mention my husband. Thank you for your hard work, carefully revealing this cauldron. But it was just amazing for us all to kind of see that moment of it being broken, being stoved in. As it was revealed, there was a stone still sitting in it. And turned upside down, you know, it's a beautiful colour. It almost looks like it's been painted. But but it doesn't quite look, it almost looks like, a flat pack cauldron carry with you. It might have been something a little bit like the Glenfield cauldrons, these a little bit earlier, but instead of having this big, thick iron rim, it just has a very narrow one. And the copper alloy covered and decorated that iron rim. And then in the center was this disc that we hadn't realized quite how great it was until we had a CT scan done. And I think the black and white shows the image much better, where you have fish, one here, one there, and then there's another one missing, and you can sort of see them in the angled lights photo. Almost looks like fingers of a hand, the tail of the fish there, and one there. Could be trout, could be salmon. Certainly unusual to find in an Iron Age vessel, a vessel that would be used for feasting, perhaps producing stews. There's not much evidence that people were consuming fish at this time in the Iron Age, so what's going on here? They're just having fun with a fish on a dish in the bottom of their bowl. And the other vessel that Thomas kindly let me talk about here, as it was found right at the edge of the trench and revealed, excavated down the sides, this incredible face. It has these two masks, one on either side. They don't show up so well at the moment while it's going through the conservation process, which is why we're showing the excavation photo. But it looks like it's got Medusa hair. It's not hair. That's part of the decoration behind that's got bent back. So this was a vessel that had a shoulder, and the hair on the face is actually pulled back, which is quite typical you see on Iron Age buckets. And then if you look through the hole, the team on site kindly sent some photos looking through the hole, and you can see something inside, which is this item, which looks a little bit like a bowl, but it's not much use as a bowl. It's kind of crimped together. And I think it sits very perfectly within that space where there would be a lid. And if you look here, there's these little key shapes around the edge. So imagine we're looking at this upside down. Now, I don't know whether anyone has one of these bottles where you kind of put the top in and twist it to close it. That's exactly what you're looking at here, a kind of locking mechanism for a lid. So it seems that our metal lid is missing a wooden element that would have helped hold it all together. At least that's my working theory. And perhaps we're more like, okay, maybe not this extravagant, but more like this kind of shouldered bowl, the sort of leaves, the Etruscan-style wine mixing bowls, which is why we're talking about it as a wine mixing bowl. It's certainly not suited for heating and would have been adorned around the shoulders and also, again, with coral. One of the things I think particularly great about it is underneath was this cow toe bone, which is always good to find something nicely sealed in the bottom of your deposit that you might be able to radiocarbon date it. So I'm going to show you the world's briefest timeline and then pass back to Tom, who can talk to you a little bit more about how we're interpreting the site and the remains. So around 500 BC, wagons on the continent. We don't have any evidence for them in Britain, these four-wheeled vehicles. We are getting evidence for two-wheeled chariots, particularly in the chariot burials from East Yorkshire. We're also getting these hoards of horse harness, generally a lot smaller than Melsonby, hence our expectation it wasn't going to be quite so big. Caesar came along, had a go down the southeast. And at some point, we think, between Caesar's attempts to invade Britain and possibly before or just after the Claudian invasion is when we have these Melsonby deposits. And the radiocarbon dates so far say that we're right to be within that ballpark. And hopefully we'll be able to get a narrow date in the future. And some of you will spot Queen Cartimandua was thought to have ruled just after this happened. I'll pass you back to Tom.
Thank you, Sophie. One of the great things about the Melsonby discovery is not just the amazing finds, which Sophie has illustrated to you, which are, of course, incredible, but also that we can say quite a lot about the archaeological context of those finds. And of course, as you'll all be aware, that's not always the case with metal detectorist finds. And that's partly because we undertook the archaeological excavation of these finds, but also because we've done other archaeological work in the area, including geophysics and the work of other colleagues previously. The first thing to note is that and I have to say, be a little bit coy about exactly where the Melsonby finds are for obvious reasons, but the finds are from just to the southeast of Stanwick, this major royal site or oppidum from the late Iron Age in North Yorkshire. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Stanwick or royal sites, these are these sites that emerged in the late 1st century BC and 1st century AD. Huge site covering at least 270 hectares with 7 kilometres of massive ramparts. There's Mortimer Wheeler's excavations from the 1950s. And the excavations of Mortimer Wheeler and then Colin Hazelgrave in the 1980s and 1990s demonstrated that Stanwick was almost certainly the main focal place, assembly place for these people we refer to as the Brigantes, who occupied much of what is North Yorkshire and County Durham. And Colin's work in particular demonstrated that the community at Stanwick had close relationships probably with the expanding Roman Empire, with exotic diplomatic gifts, suggesting probably that some of the inhabitants there were perhaps even part of a client kingdom or queendom in the late Iron Age. For those of you who don't know royal sites, one of the reasons they're called that is their counterparts to Stanwick in southern Britain, like Colchester, Camulodunum, St Albans, Verulamium, have elaborate rich burials associated with them, like this example at Lexton at Colchester, with a range of grave goods and exotic imports. And it implied to many people that the people at these sites were regarding themselves as kings. I hasten to add we don't have one of those at Stanwick, but hold that thought perhaps. Now, in terms of the relationship of what we found in 2022 to what was found in 1843, as Sophie demonstrated, the similarities between the material chronologically, stylistically, between the 1843 material and what we found suggest they are very closely related and probably are from the same rough location. We can also even comment a little bit more on those 19th century finds. There's this comment which I particularly love from 1847 about those 19th century finds that says, a spot adjacent to where this deposit was found, large iron hoops, conjectured to be tyres of chariot wheels, had been discovered. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about what they were referring to at that time. I hope I don't speak for Sophie too much, but I think we both agree that this implies perhaps there was a fourth hoard which had iron. And of course, those iron tyres were perhaps just thrown away, melted down, which of course emphasises that the material we have at Melsonby is perhaps even greater than what we're talking about tonight. That said, my first supposition when I came out to see Peter's discovery that he had found the remnants of what was found in 1843 was incorrect. Neither of the hoards we found in 2022 had been disturbed prior to Peter's intervention. But I think I would say, certainly, I'm sure Sophie would agree, that it's very likely that the hoard, the early 19th century finds, are perhaps meters away from these discoveries. So they are part of perhaps the same process. And as Sophie emphasised with the chronology, a good chance that these are a set of sequence of events which are closely related, or perhaps even a single event. We can say more now about the actual wider archaeological context of those. As I say, I'm going to be vague about actually where the location of these finds are for obvious reasons. But as I say, the location of the hoards is just to the southeast of the ramparts of Stanwick. There they are at the top left there. And what you're looking at is geophysics that we've done of much of the area outside Stanwick and beyond indeed. And for those of you who are not familiar with magnetometry, what you're looking at here is all the black things are ditches, pits. You can even see individual roundhouses in this geophysics. If I just turn on the interpretation, that might help you a bit. The key point to take from this is that our hoards are deposited in an intensively occupied landscape full of field systems, enclosures, roundhouses, settlement, and so on. Now, don't worry, because Sophie always looks at me a bit kind of like worried when I get onto this point, because she thinks I'm going to talk about the geophysics at length. Don't worry, I could do, but I know you've got somewhere else to be tonight probably. But I will point you to one thing, and that is that our hoards are not far from this thing, this major trackway or droveway, which comes from the southeast, probably from the late Iron Age settlement, Scotch Corner, I would surmise, and pointing towards the royal site at Stanwick. And I hold that in your minds, because I think that might be significant in understanding the context of these finds. Which brings me on to then, what are our initial thoughts on why was the material at Melsonby deposited? Well, the first thing I think is to remind ourselves of what Sophie was saying, really, which was the incredible amount of material, the fact that we have, as Sophie said, a minimum of 2 four-wheeled wagons, exceptional vehicles from Britain, but also the quality of the material that you've seen here. This is, the best kind of an elaborate horse harness and vehicle gear, but also the other objects, rare items like that possible wine mixing vessel, even the lances that Sophie showed. These are exotic items, these are rare items, these are exceptional items. So we're seeing here huge amounts of portable wealth, much of it being burnt in Hoard 1 and perhaps the 19th century finds, and then being broken up and deposited in the ground. Why would you do that? The other thing to note is the choices of that material, the fact that there is a selection process. So the focus, as Sophie was showing, on horse gear, parts of vehicles, also some feasting equipment, but but exclusion of other things. One thing that I always find fascinating is we didn't find any pottery in either of those excavations. Now, we have found pottery in excavations that I've undertaken nearby. That seems interesting. Are they deliberately excluded? We found very little in the way of bone and no human bone. So there seem to be choices taking place of what goes into these hoards. So what are our possible interpretations? And we are at the beginnings of thinking about these interpretations. Well, many of you will know that MacDonald argued that the 19th century finds were probably recycling by a metal worker, for safekeeping and coming back and retrieving. I think all of us who worked on Melsonby are not convinced by that argument, either for what was found in the 19th century or what we found in 2022. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is that our excavations didn't find any evidence of metalworking tools, of crucibles, not even slag, the kind of things that you might expect if this was near a metalworking location and then deposited. Also, the choices, those choices I just mentioned, that there are deliberate choices in what's going into these hoards, which seem to exclude some objects and include others. Also, the treatment of those objects. We've mentioned a number of times the fact that all of the tyres have been, to a greater or lesser degree, bent out of shape. As Sophie mentioned, some almost certainly heated up to do that. Some of them, as I showed you earlier, almost bent into a figure of 8 shape. Seems unnecessary if you're just recycling them. And of course, from an Iron Age perspective, it's something we're familiar with. If you look at the sites on the left there, I have a sanctuary site, Gournay-sur-Aronde from northern France, a votive deposit site from Hjortsbing in Denmark, where you can see those swords completely bent out of shape. And for an Iron Age specialist, that kind of deliberate, perhaps putting out of use is something we might expect from a more of a structured deposit or a votive deposit. And also I come back to that point made about the throwing of the boulders onto these deposits, the smashing of that cauldron, the breaking up of objects. Again, something we're familiar with, that there's a deliberate and dramatic breaking of these objects. So can we see it perhaps something as more like a votive or ritual deposit? Certainly one of the best sort of analogies, if you like, for Melsonby, certainly in scale of items, is Llyn Cerrig Bach in North Wales, some of you will be familiar with. This is a deposit in a lake site where we have similar kind of material, horse harness, bits of vehicles, martial equipment, and it's similar scale. But there are differences from Melsonby from this. One key point is, as Sophie said, the chronology of Melsonby that we have at the moment suggests this is a short sequence of events. Llyn Cerrig Bach looks like it was material deposited over hundreds of years. Very different, perhaps. Also, I have to say, I think that the relationship to Stanwick is also key here. There's a clear relationship with the royal site. So this isn't out in the landscape. There seems to be a relationship with Stanwick. Wheeler, back in the 1950s, had argued that the 19th century finds were perhaps a disturbed chariot burial. So the kind of thing that some of you will be familiar with from East Yorkshire, that you see on the left here, dismantled chariot in a burial. It's clear that our finds from 2022 are not these. You can see here from Hoard 1, it does not look like that. And of course, we have no human remains along with the deposit. And as Sophie mentioned, not least, that rite had finished about 150 years before Melsonby went in the ground, even in East Yorkshire. So it is not a chariot burial in strict terms. But we have been thinking that there are elements of what we find at Melsonby that make us think that it might be related to a funerary event. And one of the reasons for that is going back to that issue that much of the material from Hoard 1, material from Hoard 3, the 19th century material, has been burnt or partially burnt, including bits of copper alloy that have melted completely, a dribble of silver, and thinking about, well, how could that take place? And one possibility, of course, is on a funerary pyre. Now, bear in mind that the time that we think Melsonby goes in the ground is the time that cremation rite is becoming more popular, particularly for an elite in southern Britain, and that sometimes objects are placed on those pyres, partially burnt, and then put in the ground. Could we be seeing something similar happening with the material at Melsonby? And I have to say, when we look at some of the when we've been searching, over the last couple of years for analogies and parallels for Melsonby, cremation burials like the one you see in the middle there, Marolles-sur-Seine in France, looks quite similar to Hoard 1. You can see all the things here are iron tyres. We have this copper alloy cauldron turned upside down and martial equipment. So are we seeing something similar? It's also interesting that many of the finds we have, when we look at those elaborate burials associated with royal sites that I mentioned earlier, here's the reconstruction of Folly Lane associated with St. Albans, Verulamium, dating more or less, to when we think Melsonby went in the ground. It's striking that some of the material we have from Melsonby is very similar in character to these funerary assemblages. The ring mail that we have from Melsonby, also at Folly Lane, and decorated parts of vehicles. Here's I'm going to say nave pan, I am a southerner, similar to the example from Melsonby. So have we something similar? And remember when I talked, and I know I'm being coy about exactly where it is, but when I said, where is it in the landscape? Well, where do we find those elaborate burials associated with royal sites? Well, going back to Colchester, Camalodunum, outside the earthworks, the ramparts to those sites, and usually on routeways into those complexes. Where did we find the remains from Melsonby? On a routeway outside Stanwick and going into Stanwick. So it's an interesting possibility. I'm sure you will have noticed the flaw in that argument, where you don't have any human remains from Melsonby. And I think that's where we have to think too, is that often our distinction between what is a funerary assemblage, what is a votive deposit, what is a structured deposit, may be too neatly drawn. You know, we don't have to, we may not be looking at a primary burial, for instance, associated with this. It may be some other kind of rite that we're looking at where the human remains are treated in different ways. These may be memorials. So I think we have to think a little bit differently about what we're looking at here and rather get tied up on definitions of is this a funeral or is it not? But I think it's interesting to think about those possibilities. Whatever the nature of the event that took place at Melsonby, and I think Sophie has ably demonstrated the quality of the material, the amount of material that was brought together, but also the fact that we have feasting equipment, meant whatever that event was bringing together large numbers of people, those vehicles, perhaps groups from all over North Yorkshire. Can we associate that with an individual? Well, as Sophie mentioned, we do know of one individual who almost certainly probably lived at Stanwick at some point in the later 1st century AD, and that's Queen Cartimandua. Most of you will know that we know about Queen Cartimandua thanks to the Roman historian Tacitus. I'm not going to get into the long discussion about from Tacitus, but to cut it short, basically Tacitus tells us that she was almost certainly an ally of Rome, at least for part of the time, handing over Caractacus or Caractacus to the Romans. She then split up with her husband. As I always say, it's a bit of a messy divorce because it ended up in a civil war amongst the Brigantes. I hope none of that's happened to any of you. And then the Romans came in to rescue her. Now, leaving aside how much we take from Tacitus and how much we believe it, if you believe the chronology, as Sophie mentioned, she was probably active about AD 47 to about AD 69. Could it be associated with her? Well, of course, the issue is there that our chronology at the moment and the radiocarbon dates actually suggest the Melsonby hoards probably went into the ground a few decades before she was active. In many ways, I don't think that matters because what it emphasizes is the wealth and status of the community at Stanwick prior to that point. And of course, it may also be related to an individual related to her, perhaps a mother, a grandmother, or a father, who was just of equal status. We just don't know about that individual because, of course, Roman historians didn't write about them. And I think that's the great thing about Melsonby. It demonstrates that connection. As Sophie hinted at as well, there are interesting things there about perhaps who that person was. Could it have been a female authority figure who we don't know about, who was there beforehand? And of course, increasingly we're understanding from the Iron Age how many important female figures there were in that period. So it's exciting to think about other individuals. As you'll have gathered, at the moment, really, because of the nature of how we have dealt with Melsonby, we're only really at the beginnings of our research on that. And there's so much more, as Sophie mentioned, to examine. One of the things we're working on at the moment is refining the chronology with more radiocarbon dates to try and understand exactly when it was deposited. There's lots more materials analysis to do, and also a massive job of conservation work to be done. And all of that work will almost certainly change the narrative and the interpretations and the story we've told tonight. And once that, I hope we'll have the opportunity to come back and update you on our thinking of what the hoards represent. And before I finish, I would just like to say, as I said at the beginning, the project at Melsonby really has been a team effort from the very beginning, from the finder, Peter Heads, through an incredible team. Some of him are here tonight. We've worked on excavating the project, conserving it, and advisors and specialists have been involved. So, and now I have to say that Yorkshire Museum have acquired the material, working with them on how we can continue to do research and help them in displaying that material. So thank you to all of those people involved. And thank you very much to you all tonight for listening to us and enjoying the Melsonby hoard as much as we do. Thank you.
Tom, Sophie, thank you very much indeed. These rooms have witnessed the presentation of major finds from archaeology over 150 years. This evening is one of those moments when we've seen one of the finds which stands out for this century and beyond. So we're very, very grateful to you for presenting. What wonderful material. I was privileged not long after it came out of the ground to be shown the material by Tom in Durham, and I walked away sort of completely poleaxed by the experience. There are lots of questions I'm sure people want to ask. If I can kick off with one, I want to go back to your coral, because that was the thing that struck me when I sort of first saw it sort of laid out. It's extraordinary and must imply continental contacts, presumably. Thinking on from that, are there other things that are showing sort of continental influence in it as you're seeing it at the moment? And I wonder then how that fits into the sort of chronological narrative in a sense.
Yeah, so the coral is astounding, not just the quantity of it, but the way it's been finished. Some of you may have noticed the way they kind of carefully drilled the center of some of those beads. So we haven't been able to do any scientific analysis right directly on the coral, but we took some SEM images and showed them to Caroline Cartwright at the British Museum, who's an expert on ancient coral, and it does appear to be Corallium rubrum, which for those of you who are very familiar with that material will know, it's red Mediterranean coral, the precious red coral. So it's got to have come a great distance, which is, yeah, as you say, is absolutely fascinating. Now, I don't think in terms of the objects, there's anything that shows quite such a direct connection in the hoards. And I'll pass over to Tom in a minute just to mention in terms of Stanwick finds, the sort of potential connections with those. But just also the materials. So glass, Iron Age glass, the flux in it, natron, is coming from sort of Egypt, potentially Syria, and also the silica in it. So we've got this materials, and there's this long distance movement of them for several centuries before this point. And so I think those are interesting things to explore. But also in terms of the design of the objects, the connections, there's a lot actually heading further north. And it's been interesting talking to Fraser Hunt of National Museum of Scotland to see some of the parallels and sort of trumpet shapes you see in the designs with some of the items from southern Scotland, for example. So we've got this kind of northern emphasis there, but then we've got this mirror that's following a kind of southern style of mirror design, and then we've got these objects coming from, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. I think that's really fascinating. But don't you think with Stanwick that, you've got imported objects coming at the same time, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sophie's explained the coral brilliantly there. I mean, I think one of the things that excites me is that Melsonby's showing those connections, perhaps prior to the Roman conquest, and in different ways that are not necessarily. There's the as Colin's work showed, imports coming in quite early, and a lot of those imports coming in are exotic items. I don't want to speak for Colin, but diplomatic goods, if you like. But also the fact that we've got this coral, but also, I mean, I'm always fascinated by the fact that we've got those potential four-wheeled wagons, and if we're right, and they do look like the things from Denmark, that the community at Stanwick are embedded in a whole connection all over the place, and we're seeing those hints that we don't sometimes see, not with a nice Roman vessel, but with all these other things perhaps a little bit earlier. So I think the coral's kind of speaking to that they're very well connected, these people, geographically as well as.
That resonates, because it for me, I would be happier to see it a bit earlier than in the sort of Claudian period with the Gartamanager and so forth. So, but I've got an axe to grind. Can we open the Sam? The mic will come round to people online to discussion.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Can I ask about the practicalities of finding something like that? What do you do in terms of excavating it without any money? Who do you go to for the money? Did you get Christmas that year, or did you just stay out in the field?
So one thing I realised I hadn't said is that the counted up items is over 900 items. And yes, I often say to people, it's awe in all senses of the words, that we were, you know, filled with awe at seeing these things, but also that fear of how we're going to deal with this. And I think we were very fortunate that because Tom had already been working in the landscape, there was an established relationship there. And we were very grateful to all the people who gave up their bank holiday in August, and, you know, to various people at the museum who kind of made it possible for me to stay there longer and us to get a team in to do the site. And Historic England, their support was just fantastic, but they were asking, you know, could you make it almost like this is a method to use? But we can't imagine we'll ever be in this situation again with a find like this. I mean, it's always possible. But if you want to say a bit more about the team.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, as I alluded to, certainly I wasn't expecting it to be as elaborate as it was. So, you know, we did sort of work as a small group of PhD students and so on. I have to say, Historic England were fantastic once we realised this was more than the Department of Archaeology at Durham could support, and the inspector Keith Embrick, who's acknowledged here, you know, was fantastic in saying, right, okay, this is a national find, you need support there. And I think it's a model to follow in terms of working with colleagues and working with landowners and finders, but it's not something we can do all the time, and nor would we try to. It's Melsonby is exceptional in that regard.
Thank you. That was superbly illustrated as well as announced. I last and only sat on a horse at the age of 4, and I've never been in a chariot or a carriage. And you explained and demonstrated beautifully what the various elements that held things together were, but I did not follow what a chariot was. There were various sizes of ring, and they were either decorated or they were functionally added to, if you see what I mean, the basic ring. And perhaps you could explain what a chariot is and what it was used for.
Yeah, so they're also known as rain rings. So it's when you have 2 ponies, so all the vehicles are pulled by 2 ponies, and each pony has 2 reins coming off it. And they pass through the territs that are sitting on the yoke to stop them tangling, and so that then you can guide each pony. The question is the middle terret and quite what that's for. And some suggestion is that its purpose is solely to attach it to the pole that becomes between the horses. So we're not like people think about wagons now with the poles coming either side and the ponies between. It's the pole comes in the middle, and then the yoke sits over, and there's some suggestion it sits over there with us, some suggestion it sits further back. It may have been different designs. So it could just been for that attachment. Another thought is that it's for an extra guiding or steering rein through the middle. Yeah, there's all sorts of possibilities, but all you need is a ring that you can attach to the wooden yoke. It doesn't need to be that fancy. And that's what I think is just lovely, that they've gone overboard, and some of those details you would only see up close. So you can almost imagine everyone standing around having a look at, you know, oh, your wagon's incredibly fancy. Look at the bits you put on it. Yep. So stopping your reins tangling. Yep. That's right.
Thank you. We've had several questions online. One person is asking about the next steps at Yorkshire Museum and what we know about the timescale for display and what's happening next.
Yes, I mean, now the material has been acquired by Yorkshire Museum, and we're working with them to try and look at when that can be placed on display. I don't have any dates of when that's going to happen. As you can imagine, Melsonby is a huge amount of material, so there's a lot of work that Yorkshire Museum have to do to consider that. So it'll take a little bit of time, but I'm sure there will be announcements once it goes on display in due course. But we're working, all of us, who have worked together, trying to continue to work together to help Yorkshire Museum in that process.
Other questions, comments? The lady there.
Thank you very much. The soil in the block looked quite coarse and grainy. Has that made a difference to the task of conservation?
So what you could see is where all the soil that could possibly be removed is removed. And some of that, yeah, there were quite a few stones in it. But weirdly, it wasn't within the block, it was just on the outside. So the challenge, conservation challenge it made was removing it without realizing that you're damaging an object. And one of the interesting things was how to manage this block of items. It weighs over 200 kilos. And we didn't know how much it weighed when it went to MuVIS. And they said, well, we can take 250 kilos. And we're like, oh, yeah, sure, it'd be fine. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think they're using it as an argument that they could also get some bigger machinery. But so it's sort of removing it with this kind of paleo tool. But in terms of the kind of conservation of how the finds are preserved inside, so this is another thing to consider. They're very stable if they're kept in a dehumidified environment. So the whole room was made that stable environment while Emily was working on it. And the idea is at the moment, so it's got its own special storage box that it's in a safe environment that way. And you could, in theory, display it again in a controlled environment and it will stay together. And one discussion we had to have is in terms of treasure process, did that count as seeing all the objects within? And it was agreed unanimously that this was an object in itself. This is as it was found. It has various components. It has all different items in it, but it's a single object. And it's amazing seeing, like, people bow down to the block. when people are coming in to see it, and also the team who created the box for traveling it and storing it, everyone just kind of gets down on the knees and has a look, and it's, oh, this is amazing. Look, I can see one of these, and so many of the items within it you can see from the other hoards, so you can see what they are. But then we've got that CT scan data, which you can do all sorts of amazing things with. So it will be a challenge that you have to maintain that environment because you've got the different metals. But also the different metals in some way have helped preserve each other because, now I really need Emily here to explain it, but it's how more base metals kind of sacrifice themselves in advance of more precious metals. So it helps create that environment. But yes, it'll be interesting to see, the challenges. I mean, I'm sure Yorkshire, are very excited to have the find, but also probably there's an element where they go, oh, what have you found for us? But yeah.
Are you able to determine how worn in use these pieces are? Were they manufactured to be buried?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So it's something we haven't been able to go into a lot of detail at the moment, because really so much of the work has just been recording the 900 items. I've done a description for every single one. They live in my head. But they don't have the wear, like some of the bits you see, I think it's Melsonby hoard up in Scotland, where you can really see where the links have worn away and been well used. You haven't got any evidence for that. So they're really good, usable condition, which again is fascinating, that they're taken out of circulation when they could still be reused. And a lot of the breakage seems to be deliberate or through the heating rather than broken through use.
Oh, that was fascinating. I was particularly impressed by the scale of everything, with the big tyres and the big link pieces. Is there any evidence that they actually smashed up the cart and or the chariot, and that you've got nails and things that relate to the structure, so you can get some idea of the scale of the object that they came from?
Done a good sell on the finds. Yes, there's a lot of ironwork that goes with it. There's something like 75 nails or bolts that, we haven't quite worked out where they come from. There's all these various brackets. There's things that, as the farm said, best look like coupling rings, where you've got a kind of iron bar that's bent over and a loop on it that, is ideal for pulling. So what does that part come from? There's also a couple of moments in the deposit where you can see the nave bands that go on the outside and the inside are kind of in relative positions. There's only a couple of moments in that. So what it looks like is occasionally the wooden hub was in a condition that it was still together. Perhaps it was partly charred or something and went into the ground, whereas most of the rest of it is all just disbanded all over. And the tyres, there's not a single one that's in its full round shape. So my kind of imagining in my head at the moment is you have this procession coming up to this site. Then they've got to uncouple the horses. Then they're taking off the various parts. I mean, these wagons are designed so you can take the wheels off, and apparently that's better for storage. Anyone storing your wagons, take the wheels off and prop them up so the axle won't bend. They're taking it all apart, and we think throwing them on a bonfire or a pyre. And then I start thinking, okay, well, the ponies are led away, at least as far as we know. And they've taken all this regalia off the pony. So what happens then? Do they release them into a field? I don't know. It's quite fascinating when you try to think through the processes that are involved. But I don't think that nothing went in whole. So I think it's been dismantled. But there's always a possibility some parts were not attached to the vehicle and came. Yeah.
I'm probably the least qualified person in this room to ask questions about the British Iron Age, but there was also the weapons as well. Can you say something a little bit about them and how they connect with all this chariot gear, and how does this all fit together?
Yeah. So it's interesting, actually, some of the questions that Tom's had doing talks up in sort of around Stanwick area, because there's a big military population, isn't there, around there? Yeah, and these kind of questions, is it decommissioning weapons and things, but there's not a lot of weapons. And like the examples from Gorney and stuff, they haven't been built. So in the 1843 hoard, there was a sword in a scabbard. We don't have any swords. We could maybe have elements of scabbards, perhaps. So the only weapons that we've been able to identify in Hoard 1 are these three huge spears, you know, really big. And looking at research on spears, like von Innel's PhD research, you know, these are much more suited to parade and showing off than for throwing, or potentially you could use them for thrusting. It's noticeable that, again, the wooden shaft isn't there. We don't know whether they went in with those. But then the spears in the other bundle are a bit more of a usable size, but missing the wooden elements. And there's no sign of burning in that bundle. So there's something slightly different going on between those two hoards. But yeah, quite what it is in terms of the weapons, we don't know. But yeah, there's no other weaponry. No.
I mean, for me, one of the interesting things with the finds is that selection process. And also, you know, when I was alluding to the fact that you've got differences, as Sophie just saying there, between Hoard 1 and Hoard 2, there's similarities across them, but also differences. And that makes you start speculating whether they're separate groups, perhaps bringing certain items that represent those groups. And that's very speculative at the moment, but I think it's something that we'd like to research more on and think, do these represent, because as Sophie said when she was talking about the finds, you know, there's some interesting issues there. We haven't got all of the bits of the vehicle, so what's the selection process there, and is that deliberate fragmentation? A lot of that, you know, we're only beginning to disentangle. But yes, going back to Sophie's point, there was this kind of idea that, like, I've been sort of asked, oh, is it decommissioning weapons after a battle or something? I would personally argue no, partly not just because of the nature of the incredible vehicles, but also the feasting equipment. You know, we kind of, because there's so much amazing stuff, you forget there's an incredible cauldron, there's the potential wine mixing vessel, there's also the stave bucket that Colin Hazelgrove thinks was in the 19th century. So there's also communal eating and drinking going on associated with these events. So there's a lot to unpick there in terms of what that event was, or sequence of events.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested by what you guys were talking about, the size, the wheel that is absolutely huge. And it made me think about functionality. Do we think that that huge wheel was actually quite a functional object? I know you said there's no usage on it. And then the lack of the 5, the lack of these numbers that we would expect to have set numbers of chariots. Is it supposed to be a functional assemblage, or is there a selection in there?
That's a good question. Yeah, so in terms of the wheels, actually, we haven't really done much in the way of assessment. So it is potential there's evidence for wear on those. The ironwork was very much a case of sealing it and making it stable. But the size of the wheel, recently I was looking at an example in France at the National Archaeology Museum there. One of their chariots has actually quite large wheels on it. So I think, you know, we're sort of comparing it with what's more typical in Britain. For Iron Age wheels, they tend to be smaller. So the possibility that a bigger wheel could be used is absolutely fine. The other thing I haven't had an answer to yet is whether you could have, say, smaller wheels on the front and larger wheels on the back. And you see that on wagons in different periods. So, yeah, it's certainly works and is workable. And then, yeah, well, in terms of trying to, I mean, it makes you think of, is it Newbridge chariot burial, where they think potentially they're sort of recreating a vehicle from the parts. Perhaps, yeah, I mean, it would be an interesting question for us to pose. We'll add that to the list. Thank you.
There are no other questions or comments. Can we thank our speakers again for a truly memorable. I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 20th of November, when we will hear a paper, the 1225 Magna Carta, A More Compassionate Society, by Professor Louise Wilkinson. Meeting stands adjourned. There's a drink outside. Do please join us.